All right, listener, you ready to dive into some rule books?
Rule books.
Yeah, the rule books for the Barclays Women's Super League and the championship.
Oh, wow.
I know, right? It doesn't exactly sound like a thrilling time, but stick with us because honestly, it's way more interesting than you might think.
Yeah, it really is like getting a backstage pass to how these leagues actually work, all the behind-the-scenes stuff that makes the whole thing tick.
Exactly. It's all about, the hidden machinery that makes the whole operation run.
And trust me, you're going to find some surprising stuff in there.
Oh, absolutely. So let's kick things off by tackling the basics. Who's actually in charge here? Who's calling the shots?
Right. Well, in this case, the big boss, the one who owns, organizes, and pretty much manages everything, is Leagues OpCo.
Leagues OpCo.
Yep. Think of him as like the ultimate authority for the WSL and the WC.
Okay, so Leagues OpCo is at the top, but there's got to be some kind of system to keep things in check, right? It can't just be a free-for-all.
Oh, you're absolutely right. There are definitely checks and balances, and that's where the board and the executive operational committee come in.
Okay, so they're kind of like the league's government.
Exactly. They set the strategies, enforce the rules, and make sure everything's running smoothly.
So basically a system of checks and balances to prevent anyone from having too much power and to ensure everything stays fair.
Precisely. And here's where it gets really interesting. Players and club officials can't be on the executive operational committee.
Wait, really? Why is that?
Well, imagine a scenario where a player or a club owner could directly influence decisions that might benefit them personally. That's a conflict of interest, right?
Yeah.
This rule eliminates that possibility, ensuring that all decisions are made independently and fairly.
Wow, that's a huge commitment to impartiality. It really shows they're serious about creating a level playing field.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that focus on transparency and fairness is a recurring theme throughout these rulebooks.
Okay, so let's dig into that a bit more. How does a club actually become a member of the WSL or the WC? Is it as simple as just having a team and saying, hey, we want to join?
Oh, no, not at all. There's a bit more to it than that. First things first, your club needs to be officially set up as a company in England and Wales. No exceptions.
So it's not just about what happens on the pitch, but also about having your business affairs in order.
Exactly. It's all about building a sustainable and credible league with clubs that are run professionally.
That makes sense. So once you've got your company structure all sorted, what's the next step?
Then you sign what's called a participation agreement with Leagues OpCo.
Participation agreement.
Yeah, think of it as a contract that lays out all the rules and obligations that each club has to follow.
So it's like a legally binding promise to play by the rules.
Precisely. And they're super serious about transparency. Clubs have to be totally upfront about any changes, whether it's new directors, name changes, anything really.
Even like updates to their company documents.
I got it. They have to report everything.
Wow, they're really dotting their I's and crossing their nets.
Yep. It's all about accountability. And speaking of details, we should probably talk about the grounds where these epic matches actually happen, because those come with their own set of rules as well.
Right, because location matters, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For Tier 1 and Tier 2 clubs, your home ground has to be in either England or Wales, depending on where your club is based.
Okay, that makes sense. Keeps things geographically logical and I guess helps with travel costs.
Exactly. Now, here's a question for you. What happens if a club's usual ground isn't available? Let's say it's undergoing renovations or something. Can they just pick any old field to play on?
I'm guessing there are some rules about that.
You bet. If a club needs to use an alternative ground, they have to get approval from Leagues OpCo. And that alternative ground has to meet the same standards as their regular stadium.
So no playing on a muddy pitch just because your fancy stadium is getting a new scoreboard.
Nope, the rulebook is all about ensuring a quality experience for both the players and the fans.
Now, while we're talking about stadiums, we should probably touch on ground sharing. It's pretty common in football, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's like having roommates, but for football clubs.
So what are the rules surrounding ground sharing?
Well, just like having roommates, it comes with its own set of guidelines. You can't use ground sharing as a sneaky way to try and get promoted or avoid relegation.
Right, so no manipulating the system just because you happen to share a home ground with another club.
Exactly. And any longer-term agreements also need Leagues OpCo's approval, just to make sure everything's above board.
Now, here's something I'm curious about. What about artificial pitches? Are those allowed in the WSL and the WC?
Now this is where things get interesting. You know how artificial pitches are a bit of a hot topic in men's football?
Yeah, for sure.
Well, in Tier 2, they're actually allowed.
Really? That's a pretty significant difference.
It is. But don't worry, they don't just let teams play on any old AstroTurf. These artificial pitches have to undergo rigorous FIFA quality tests to make sure they meet the standards.
So it's not like playing on concrete or anything like that.
Definitely not. And to make sure it's fair for everyone, the visiting team actually gets a chance to practice on the artificial surface the day before the match.
Oh, that's smart. It gives them a chance to get used to it and make sure that the surface itself doesn't give one team an unfair advantage.
Exactly. And that attention to detail extends even further when it comes to the players themselves. After all, they are at the heart of the game, right?
Absolutely. So let's talk about the players. What are some of the key rules that govern them?
Well, first and foremost, players have to be registered correctly with both the FAE League Zopco in order to be eligible to play.
So there's a mountain of paperwork involved, I imagine.
More like a digital mountain these days.
Hmm.
There are specific online forms and deadlines that clubs have to adhere to. And just like in men's football, there are transfer windows.
Ah, so no last-minute panic buys or fire sales?
Nope. There are designated periods for transfers, which keeps things fair and organized. And of course, there are provisions for emergency transfers in certain situations like maternity leave or a serious injury.
Right, so there's flexibility when it's genuinely needed.
Exactly. Now let's talk about loans. Clubs are allowed to loan players to each other, but there are limits.
Right, you can't just use players as pawns in some elaborate scheme to game the system.
Precisely. The rules prevent clubs from constantly sending players back and forth. It ensures that loan deals are used legitimately for player development and squad depth.
Makes sense. Now, here's a detail that really shows how seriously they take these rules. If a club plays an ineligible player, for whatever reason, they can actually be docked points.
Oh yeah, big time. It's all about accountability. It makes those seemingly boring administrative tasks incredibly important because points are literally on the line.
No room for sloppy paperwork when the stakes are that high.
And speaking of high stakes, we should probably talk about the financial side of things. I imagine there are rules about that too, right?
You bet. Keeping the competition fair and transparent also means having rules about money. It's all about creating a level playing field and preventing richer clubs from just buying their way to the top. So let's talk about money. What are the key financial rules we need to know about?
One of the most important things is the salary cap. Think of it like a financial equalizer. It prevents clubs from spending unlimited amounts on player salaries and creating an unfair advantage.
Right, so it's all about creating a competitive balance where every club has a genuine chance regardless of their budget.
Exactly. And it's not just about basic salaries either. The salary cap includes things like signing bonuses, image rights deals, even perks like company cars or housing allowances.
Wow, they've really thought of everything. So no sneaky ways to get around the rules and shower players with extra benefits.
Nope, transparency is key here. Clubs have to provide detailed financial information to the league's OPCO, and they can even be audited to make sure they're playing by the rules.
That's really reassuring. It shows how seriously they take financial fairness and that they're actively working to prevent any shady dealings.
And it's not just about the money itself. It's about conduct and discipline both on and off the pitch. Everyone involved in the WSL and WC is expected to uphold the integrity of the game.
So what kind of rules are we talking about here? Is there like a specific code of conduct for everyone involved?
There is. League Zapco has established a clear code of conduct that emphasizes respect and professionalism. And it applies to everyone, players, officials, coaches, the whole lot.
So no shouting abuse at the referee even if you think they made a bad call.
Definitely not. And there's a system in place for dealing with anyone who breaks the rules, from warnings and fines to suspensions and even mandatory education courses.
So they're not messing around. There are real consequences for bad behavior.
Absolutely. They even have something called a table of summary offenses and sanctions. It's basically like a catalog of league crimes and their corresponding punishments.
Wow, so they've really got all their bases covered.
Yep, they've thought of everything.
Oh.
Now we've talked about the leagues, but what about the cup competition? Is that run under a different set of rules?
Yeah, is the cup a whole different ballgame?
You could say that. It
Yeah.
definitely has its own unique structure and set of rules.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these cup rules.
Well, unlike the tiered leagues, where you have to qualify, the cup competition allows every single club in both the WSL and the WC to compete. So it's a chance for everyone to have a shot at glory.
So even the underdog teams have a chance to shine and potentially cause an upset.
Exactly. The competition starts with a group stage and then moves into a knockout format. And to spice things up even more, the top 3 teams from the previous season get a bye to the quarterfinals.
So those top teams have a bit of an advantage right off the bat.
They do, but it's not a guarantee of a win. The group stage is known for being incredibly unpredictable.
Yeah.
And here's a fun fact. Any matches that end in a draw during the group stage go straight to a penalty shootout. No extra time.
Wow, talk about pressure cooker situation.
Right, so we've covered how clubs join the leagues, the rules governing the players, and even how the cup works. But what happens if a club runs into financial trouble? Do they have a plan for that?
Yeah, that's a good question because financial stability is essential for any professional sport.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's why they have a very clear set of procedures for dealing with insolvency. If a club goes bankrupt or something like that.
Okay, so it's not just a case of shutting everything down and walking away. They have a system in place to handle these situations fairly and responsibly.
Exactly. There are very specific steps to ensure an orderly process. And as with everything else in these rule books, there are consequences for financial mismanagement. Clubs can be hit with points deductions if they find themselves in financial hot water.
Wow, that's a strong incentive for clubs to manage their finances responsibly.
You bet. And here's another key point. Even if a club goes through insolvency leagues, OPCO has the final say on whether or not they can continue competing. It's not automatic. They assess the situation carefully to make sure the club is viable and capable of fulfilling its obligations.
That makes sense. It's about protecting the integrity of the league as a whole.
Precisely. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I just want to emphasize that while all these rules might seem complex at first glance, they all serve a vital purpose.
Right, they're like the glue that holds everything together.
Exactly. Without these rules and regulations, things could quickly descend into chaos.
Yeah, imagine if there were no rules about transfers or a salary cap. It could be a free-for-all.
Exactly. What we have instead is a well-structured system that's designed to foster fair competition and fuel the continued growth of women's professional football. And you know what it's working? The Barclays WSL and the championship are thriving. And that's due in no small part to this solid foundation of rules and regulations.
It's amazing how much we've learned already about the behind-the-scenes workings of these leagues.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
All right, I think this is a good place to pause for now. When we come back, we'll continue our deep dive and uncover even more fascinating details from these rulebooks.
Sounds good. I'm ready for round 2.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the rulebooks of the Barclays Women's Super League and Championship.
Part 2.
Exactly. And, we just started to scratch the surface of this fascinating world behind the scenes of these leagues.
Yeah, there's just so much to uncover.
We've already talked about how the rules ensure fairness, transparency, and financial stability. But I want to dig a little deeper into the code of conduct. We touched on it earlier, but what does it actually look like, in practice?
Right, so it's not just about, be nice.
Mm-hmm.
It's much more specific than that. League Zopco actually has 2 separate codes, one for adult players and then a separate one for coaches, team managers, club officials, that sort of thing.
So different expectations based on your role.
Exactly. So for the players, of course, they're expected to uphold the laws of the game, but also things like treating the match officials with respect and avoiding any behavior that could bring the sport into disrepute.
So basically just don't be a jerk.
Yeah, pretty much. But then the code for the coaches and the officials, it goes a step further. It emphasizes that the well-being and enjoyment of the players should always come first, even ahead of winning.
Wow, that's a really powerful statement. It shows that they're prioritizing the human side of the game.
Absolutely. And to really hammer that home, there are specific guidelines in the code for coaches and officials about working with young players.
Oh, so things like safeguarding measures to protect young athletes?
Exactly. Things like making sure parents or guardians are aware of the code's expectations, making sure that bullying is never tolerated, that sort of thing.
Yeah, really important stuff. Creating a safe and supportive environment for young players to develop their skills.
Right. And it's not just words on paper either. There are actual consequences for those who don't follow the code.
Right, because there has to be accountability.
Exactly. Depending on the severity. It can be warnings, fines, suspensions, even mandatory education courses.
So it's not just about punishing bad behavior, but also about educating people.
Right, helping them understand why these standards are so important.
Mm.
And that accountability extends to the clubs themselves, too. If they fail to enforce the code among their staff and players, they can face fines or even suspension.
So it's a ripple effect. Everyone's responsible for maintaining the integrity of the game.
Exactly. From the individual players all the way up to the clubs themselves. Now, one of the things that really stood out to me when I was going through all these rules is the incredible attention to detail.
Oh, yeah. It's really impressive.
It's like they've thought of every possible scenario and have a rule for it.
It's like they've got it all covered.
For example, did you know that there are even rules about the colors of clothing that the ball boys and ball girls have to wear?
Really? I never would have thought of that.
Makes sense though, right? Imagine if they were wearing the same colors as one of the teams. It could cause some serious confusion out there on the pitch.
Oh, yeah, you're right. It's those little details that often get overlooked but can actually have a big impact on the game.
Exactly. And then there are things like rules about the match balls. They have to be brand new, and they have to comply with the league's sponsorship agreements.
Right. So no, using those old beat-up balls from training.
Nope, everything has to be official and up to standard.
It's just fascinating to see how these seemingly minor details contribute to the overall integrity and fairness of the game.
Yeah, and they haven't just focused on the obvious stuff. They've also thought about situations that most people wouldn't even consider.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, well, what happens if a match has to be postponed or abandoned because of, unforeseen circumstances? They have a whole process for determining who's at fault, how expenses are handled, whether the match needs to be rescheduled the whole 9 yards.
So no room for arguments or finger pointing. It's all laid out right there in the rules.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And just to show you how incredibly thorough these guidelines are, they even cover things like player appearances in representative matches.
Wait, hold on. There are rules about that too.
Oh, yeah. You know how Leagues OpCo can organize matches where players from different clubs come together to represent the league, kind of like an all-star team?
Yeah, like a showcase.
Exactly. Well, there are rules about how those matches are organized and who can participate.
Wow, they really have thought of everything. It shows how much Leagues OpCo is involved in every aspect of women's football.
Right, it's all about consistency and fairness across the board. But even with all these rules and regulations, we shouldn't lose sight of the bigger picture.
Right. What's the ultimate goal here?
It's all about building a professional and sustainable future for women's football. These rules aren't just there to restrict, they're actually the foundation for growth and success.
So they're creating a framework that allows the sport to thrive.
Exactly. They're creating a level playing field, they're promoting financial stability, they're ensuring that the game is conducted with integrity and respect.
And by doing that, they're paving the way for these amazing athletes to shine and inspire future generations.
Now, we already touched on the salary cap, but I think it's worth diving a little deeper into how it actually works in practice because it's such a key part of that financial sustainability.
Okay, let's talk salary cap. How does it work?
So each club has what's called a salary cap threshold, and that's the maximum amount they can spend on player salaries and benefits during a specific period.
So it's like a budget for player compensation.
Exactly. But here's the interesting part. That threshold is not a fixed number. It can actually vary from club to club.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Well, it's based on a number of different factors like the club's turnover and the overall financial health of the league. Leagues. OpCo works with each club individually to figure out what a fair and sustainable threshold would be.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach?
Nope, they take each club's unique situation into account. And that flexibility is important because it allows clubs to grow and invest in their players while still maintaining a competitive balance across the league.
That makes sense. But how do they actually calculate what counts towards the salary cap? It can't just be base salaries, right?
Oh, you're good. It gets pretty detailed. You have to include signing bonuses, image rights, deals, performance-related bonuses, even things like housing allowances and company cars that are provided to players.
They really cover all their bases. So no room for creative accounting here.
Not a chance. And to make sure everything's above board, clubs have to submit detailed salary cap forms that outline all of these expenses. Transparency is key.
Right, so there's full accountability.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Leagues OpCo can actually audit the clubs to verify that the forms are accurate.
So they're really making sure that everyone's playing by the rules.
Absolutely. Now, there are a few exceptions to the salary cap, but they're very specific, and they require approval from Leagues OpCo.
Okay, what kind of exceptions are we talking about?
Well, for example, if a player has income from a non-football related job, that wouldn't count towards the salary cap.
So if a player's also a yoga instructor or something like that?
Exactly. But the club would have to provide evidence to Leagues OpCo that those earnings are legit and totally separate from their football activities.
Yeah, no funny business.
Exactly. And if a club wants to offer a player a new contract or bonus that would push them over their salary cap, they have to get approval from Leagues OpCo first.
So it's a very dynamic system with constant monitoring and adjustments.
Yeah, they're always keeping a close eye on things to make sure everything stays balanced.
You know, I'm starting to really appreciate just how much thought and care has gone into crafting these rules. It's clear that they've really considered every angle.
It really is impressive. It's like a carefully designed ecosystem that supports the growth and success of women's football.
And that's what makes it so fascinating to explore. Well, we're back for our final look at the Barclays Women's Super League and Championship rulebooks.
Who knew rule books could be so interesting?
I know, right? It's like a whole world behind the scenes that we never really think about.
Absolutely. A lot of moving parts.
And it's all carefully designed to, create a really strong foundation for women's professional football.
Right. It's about more than just, the matches themselves. It's about building something that can thrive in the long term.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, what's the one big takeaway you want our listeners to remember about these rule books?
I think the most important thing to remember is that these rules aren't just random restrictions. They represent a vision for the future of the sport.
A vision for how they want the leagues to grow and develop. It's
Definitely.
exactly a vision where every club has a genuine chance at success, where the finances are stable, and where the game is always played with integrity.
And respect.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like they've created this really detailed blueprint to make sure that the leagues are sustainable and that the focus stays on the sport itself and, of course, those amazing athletes.
Right, because ultimately it's about them and their talent.
So next time you're watching a WSL or a championship match, remember that there's a lot more going on than what you see on the surface.
Yeah, all those incredible goals and saves, they're happening within a system that's designed to protect the sport and help it grow.
And, maybe this deep dive has sparked your own curiosity. Maybe you want to learn even more.
I hope so. There's always something new to discover in the world of football.
That's right. So until next time, keep exploring and keep diving deep.